I'm Cinder Niemela, and along with Charlotte Gilmano, welcome to the Inspired Wisdom Podcast. I believe the most powerful gifts you can give yourself is time to reflect on your talents and experience, and then have the wisdom to act with confidence and grace. This podcast is for entrepreneurs, leaders, and individuals who want to thrive in work and life. Your journey to being connected and inspired by the world around you starts right now. My guest today is Marilyn O'Hearne. Marilyn is a master certified coach, speaker, and author of Breaking Free from Bias. She has been coaching since 1998 and in 28 countries. Marilyn says it's impossible to not work interculturally. Marilyn has been fascinated with culture and committed to peace since the age of 9. Her fascination with culture and her commitment to peace led to her coaching leaders from the United Nations since 2013. Awareness of our biases is not enough. Marilyn will discuss with us her 6-step impact process companies are using to break free from bias and boost their bottom line. You'll find links and show notes at inspiredwisdom.us. Marilyn, welcome to the call.
Thank you.
Let's start with how you got involved in coaching. I'm not sure I even know that story.
Oh, okay. So I started hearing about coaching in 1998, first reading about it in a systems journal. And I thought, wow, that sounds interesting. And I like this idea because I was working in behavioral sciences, of starting with people when they're already healthy rather than they're working on some trauma, or they're depressed, or they're anxious. That was really fun for me. And then I saw it in the newspaper, went to a local meeting, and it was like I fell in love.
Was it the ICF or was it one of the schools?
It was Barbara Walton, who became an
yes.
ICF president later, yes. But I'm not even sure whether she was involved with the ICF or not at that point.
Yeah, 98. So where did you go to school?
I went to the Institute for Life Coach Training, and then I have been trained in the UK and in Bali and, a number of places since then.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Did you live in those places, the UK and Bali?
No, I was in Bali for 6 weeks, which was fabulous. I helped with a coach training program there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then did some speaking in Jakarta, which is the next island over.
Yeah.
And Australia, New Zealand, Korea, and met with clients in Tokyo on that trip.
One trip. Wow.
Yes, 3 months. It was quite a trip.
It was. How long was the trip all total?
3 months, and half of that in Bali.
Nice. I love Bali. I've been there a couple
Yes.
times. It's
Yeah.
beautiful.
It
Really
is.
pretty.
It is.
Yeah. Just a couple episodes ago, I interviewed somebody from Indonesia, from
Oh,
Jakarta.
wonderful.
Yeah,
Oh.
it's a very interesting story. Sonardis. He's very interesting. He went to school in the U.S. and then he returned to Indonesia. So it's interesting how his perspective of his culture, after having spent most of his youth in the United States and then returning.
That is.
Yeah. Tell us something about bias that we probably don't know and we should know.
Well, I'm not sure where to start because I don't know how much you already know. People have varying understandings about bias.
Assume we don't know. We're just totally ignorant about the level set on really what bias is.
A dictionary term for bias would be just being in favor of or against something. So that sounds pretty innocent, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it can be like, I'm in favor of the KU Jayhawks. I have a bias towards that sports team. Where it can be problematic is when we have, negative biases about a certain group of people that can turn into prejudice, but we're not aware of them. So the unconscious part about bias, Cinder, is that we take in like 10,000 bits of information per moment, and we can only process, our brains can only process 40 bits. So they just do this automatic, information comes in and just automatically gets slotted. And people get slotted into safe or dangerous categories. And so we've seen the effects of this in the media, like the police shooting, because they have a profile or a bias about this group is dangerous, and they like shoot first. You know, bias is pretty innocent to start with, but when it's becomes a trigger like that, when you've got a gun in your hand, then it can be dangerous.
So we put people into one of two categories, safe or dangerous. And I imagine that goes back to our early days.
Yes, back in the primitive brain, so
Yeah.
it's the biases are in the primitive brain, not in the neocortex. The other interesting statistic is that guess how much time we spend in our unconscious, where all that filtering is going on, and we're not aware of it.
Probably most of the time.
Yes, 98+% of the time.
Wow.
Yeah. So
that's almost all the time.
It is. And so one of the things I love about coaching is we're calling things into awareness, and also coaching supervision. It's a time to reflect, to ask questions, to shift perspective so that we can become more aware of our biases and how we see things. And then we can manage them. We can update them.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the problems with bias training so far has been it's simply been teaching that step one. So I have a 6-step process, which is identifying the fact that we all have biases. And people then are aware, okay, we all have biases, because lots of times, we think, oh, yeah, somebody else, not me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's good to know. But then some people see that as an excuse just to tick off the box that, okay, I know we all have it, so now I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to think about it again. I've done the awareness training. I know I have it.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, really, that's not enough.
The bias could be anything. It's not just race or...
Absolutely, or region of the world. You're so right. We have all these cultural identities. You and I are both women, so we're seen a certain way because we are women. I'm a baby boomer, so people see me a certain way because I'm a baby boomer. So it's gender, it's generation, socioeconomic level, educational level, attire, how attractive someone is. I mean, they've done lots of research on that. And it's kind of interesting that in the US, there's a great percentage of Fortune 500 CEOs who are 6 feet and above. And that's been true of our presidents also in the US. So there's a bias towards height, a certain height. Like that means they're a leader.
I guess so. There's some privilege with height.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, it's very interesting. Well, how did you get interested in this topic?
Oh, yeah, thanks for asking. It really started about age 9, where I noticed that people, I knew there were things about my gender. There already were comments made like girls should be afraid of snakes and not climb trees or things like that, which I thought were ridiculous. But around age 9, I started noticing other things, that certain groups of people were not being treated the same, and that it included based on their religion, what region of the world they were from. I had a friend whose mom was from Japan. We went to school with, Jewish, Catholic, Christian, and there were some different viewpoints and treatments about that, and who could belong to what club based on their religion. And we even had a multiracial wedding in our home, because across the state line, Kansas City's in Kansas and Missouri, it was still illegal in Missouri. Mm-hmm. So that really, really struck me. And my parents took us to dinner at a colleague's home. And when we drove across town, it was a neighborhood I wasn't familiar with. There was a big barbed wire fence and this barking German Shepherd dog that looked really mean. And so I've always been curious, the curious coach. And when they welcomed us, I asked why they had that barbed wire fence and the mean barking German Shepherd dog. And they said, well, because we're kind of scared to live in our neighborhood. And I said, well, then why are you living in this neighborhood? Why aren't you living in our neighborhood? Because of the color of our skin. We're not allowed, to live in your neighborhood. And laws have changed, but not always the bias, the underlying beliefs behind the laws. Mm-hmm.
You were a young child, and did you hold on to this curiosity about how people form bias?
Yes, I think holding on to that curiosity and just wanting to learn more about different cultures too.
Interesting. And then you wrote the book just this past year.
Yes.
So
yes.
it took you a while to form your opinions or to do the research and write the book. But once you I remember when you decided to write, you said, I'm going to write this book this year. And you set out a plan and stuck to it. What was the catalyst that said, this is the year?
Just the way things were heating up with the U.S. in terms of the police situation, and not just in the U.S., around the world. We heard about the bombings in France and just the backlash against the refugees in Europe. And so it just really seemed to be coming to a head. And I felt called to do something about it. And again, knowing that research, that just the awareness was not enough. And there had been books already written heavy on research and promoting awareness, that I felt like there was time for, what are the next steps? What do we do about it? What's the application? And so I know coaches are using this within organizations, some of the exercises I have in the book as they work with leadership teams and with HR and OD and training departments.
Now, are they using the exercises to heighten awareness and then to make decisions about the biases that they have?
Yeah, I start the book with a scorecard, for organizations in particular, to take a look at where are we now, and then to repeat that at the end. And then the first step is identifying. There's multiple ways of identifying bias. And then the next step is, how are we going to manage it within our organization? And then the P is for tapping into potential, tapping into and unleashing the potential. And that means of everybody, not just the white men who are over 6 feet tall.
Give us some examples of successes that companies or people have realized based on the work that you're doing with them.
Thanks for asking that. I think one of the things is just even in meetings, understanding why someone is speaking up or not speaking up. Because you work with teams are your specialty, Cinder, that this is a dynamic that can happen. As I've been called in to coach leaders and organizations, I'm thinking of a woman that I'd worked with, and I always ask about culture. Tell me something about your culture. This was someone who was about my age and raised near me, but in a rural environment, which is a different culture, in a different family. My mom was an MD, and she told all of us, the boys and the girls, that we could be whoever we wanted, do whatever we wanted. In the environment that she grew up in, women were very much in the background and not speaking up and not leading. And here she was in an organization. She'd been identified as a high potential and starting to move up, but was being told, you need to speak up more. You need to learn to step into your power and lead a meeting, So part of that for her was overcoming this bias and this mindset that she had growing up. So it can be not only how people are viewing you, but what you picked up on and internalized growing up. That was a breakthrough for her. The organization was already aware of her potential, wanting to further develop it. And it was more her learning to do that and how to handle some challenging situations with people who were like challenging her authority, in the workplace. But then, on the other hand, I've had situations where it was someone from Asia or an Hispanic woman in the US who wasn't speaking up, and the organization, some of the senior team was thinking, oh, we've wasted our money. We're not getting what we want out of this person. We're not hearing their viewpoint. And what they really didn't understand was the cultural behind that is that I shouldn't speak until someone asks me a question, until all the senior people have spoken. Native Americans too, the elders speak first. So helping both sides to understand, and then there's some choice points. So either that employee, like my first leader that I was talking about, she decided to make a change in how she was raised, and she saw herself and women in organizations. These women had that choice also, or the organization could change how they had the meetings set up. They could ask for a report ahead of time from the individual. They could, instead of everybody meeting all the time in one group, they could have people pair up and then report back to the group. They could call on the individuals rather than expecting them just to speak up. There are things on both sides that people can do. It's working with the organization to see both sides of the issue and what they can do, because we know that talent loss is a big fear in organizations right now. That, the boomers are retiring and wanting to develop who else is coming up next. If I am a female and I don't see any females at the top, or maybe 1% or 2%, then I might get discouraged and leave and start my own business or go somewhere where there's more representation. Or if I see all the prize assignments going to some other group, organizations are at risk for talent loss unless they can get this. And that's why the book subtitle is Preventing Costly Complaints, Conflict, and Talent Loss. And we know how much time leaders spend in handling complaints and conflict too.
You raised several really good points that where some of the terminology gets a little blurred, or the concepts. It all paints one picture. I love the example of the women, not speaking up. People seeing their potential, but asking them to speak up. I see this a lot, particularly with women, and also with men who come from another country.
Yes.
So, for example, men who are from India, they, their belief is, well, if I have nothing of value to add, I'm not just going to pontificate. Yeah. Or if what I have to say is going to be in conflict with what my boss just said or the CEO just said, and they've got a strong perspective, I'm not going to speak up in a public venue and disgrace him or dishonor him. Mm-hmm. How do you distinguish between bias and cultural norms?
That's a great question. I think they're tied together. They're definitely tied together because we take in bias based on what we not only see but experience. They've done some research even with small children. So let's say I'm taking my 2-year-old into the grocery store and I see someone that doesn't look like me, maybe is a different race or a different age or is in dirty clothing, and I pull my child close, I walk more quickly, I don't make eye contact. The child is already picking up on that group of people is bad or I should be afraid of them.
Just the energy,
mm-hmm.
the shift in energy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I like your example about both the company and the individual taking responsibility for breaking down some of these barriers. I really like the example that you used of meetings and different ways to introduce meetings, because there's also communication style.
Yes.
And I find that people who are more comfortable asking questions, and I'll use myself as an example here. Mm-hmm. I love asking questions.
Yeah.
But when I was in executive meetings, when I was an internal executive, I got the same feedback. Well, Cinder, you're not sharing, you're not talking. And I would say the same thing. Well, I know what I'm thinking. Why do I need to share it?
Yeah.
If you want to know what I'm thinking, ask me a question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I had the same kind of barrier that I needed to overcome and learn what was of value for people. And it was a very painful experience for me. If a company says, here's a high potential female who is in a VP role, but we want you to help her with executive presence. What does executive presence mean? And is it related to some kind of bias that people have?
Well, I think it'd be really important to get clear on that. So when you talk about, that would be what I would be asking as a coach, is when you talk about executive presence and you want me to work with this person on executive presence, what kind of results are you looking for? What are the expectations in terms of behavior change or perspective change? And then unpacking that can help us see, is it a stereotype or a bias, that we want everyone to do it this way, which may be actually detrimental to the organization, because we know when organizations listen to different perspectives and honor different perspectives, then they're more profitable. That's one of the reasons why diversity works, diversity and inclusion. The proof is the more diversity and inclusion there is at the top of an organization, the board and the leadership team, the more profitable the organization is, because not everyone is thinking the same or looking at things the same. They're contributing in different ways. So if the organization were wanting to kill that might be a concern, and they may not even realize that's what's happening. I can think of working with a male on, that was one of the things that was asked for, was executive presence. He'd had a 360, and his scores of himself, his self-assessment, was lower than his peers and his boss. That was part of what they wanted updating. And in talking and exploring further, he still kind of was hanging on to his view of himself from growing up and had some negative experiences that were affecting how much he was speaking up. And that was holding him back in the organization. And so that was a big aha. And he wanted to update that and make some changes, and has risen in the ranks. And the organization has now, tapped into his full potential. That was a good investment for them. But I think it's looking at, what does that mean? What does executive presence mean to you? And does that mean everybody is going to be just the same? That may not get you the results that you want.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we all have a feeling when there is some opinion that doesn't quite match our own
Yes.
self-perception. Sometimes it's very subtle and sometimes it's just outright. When I returned from Saudi Arabia, and I was, in my 30s by now and had a couple of kids, and when people would ask, where have you been living the last 6 or 7 years? And I'd say Saudi Arabia, and they go, oh, you poor thing. It must have been terrible. So, clearly they had some opinion.
Yes.
Was not my experience at all.
Yeah. Good for you.
Yeah. So I think sometimes it's the things that people say or how they act, like you said earlier. What recommendations do you have for someone when they're on the receiving end of bias, whether it is stated or more subtle? How would a person kind of acknowledge that and then give some feedback to the person?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I do talk about a communication model in my book, but it's primarily for someone in the organization pointing out bias, but not against them, being more of an advocate for others. And then also to bring the leadership team to their attention, there really is bias in this organization and we need to do something about it. But I would say you could probably use the same model. It's best, of course, always one-on-one. So if it's someone you feel like is targeting you, not to call them out in front of the group, but say, I'd like to speak with you afterwards. It's the losing face thing again, right? Because if the person is a bully or a narcissist, especially, that's the huge thing for them. They don't want to lose face. They don't want to look bad in front of other people. And the conversation would go something like, when you said blah, 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 whatever it was, or I notice when you are putting the team together or giving the assignments, I'm not on the list. And I'm wondering if that has to do with one of my cultural identities, that I'm a woman or a boomer or whatever the case may be, a native, non-native speaker, et cetera, et cetera. And when you exclude me and other people like me from key assignments, from leadership, the research is that that's harmful for the organization. Here's the statistics. So what could we do moving forward that might make the organization and your team even more profitable and effective, that would include me, or that would reduce these remarks? So kind of tying it to the bottom line business seems to be effective. Here's what I notice is going on, and here's the results that are not good for the organization. How could we change that? How could it be different to make you more successful as the team leader or whatever their position is, and also the organization?
Boy, that takes a lot of courage.
Yes, it does. It does. I would say also developing advocates, people who get it, who will stand up for you and say, I think Cinder should get that assignment.
Yes, that is a really good point. It sounds like, too, it's with a lot of patience and careful thinking about how you present this feedback.
Yes.
In a really calm, respectful way, which is difficult because you're triggering me in some way by excluding me or sitting across the room when I go to sit next to you. Or, we see all kinds of things that happen.
Yeah, it might be good to rehearse it with your coach first, right?
Yeah. Yes, several times. Maybe try it on someone who you already know and respect first. Do a little role playing first.
That's right.
that's really good. And I'm thinking of a few examples where that didn't happen because it can sure backfire.
Yeah, it can work. And that encouragement to hang in there.
Yeah, definitely. That just reminds me of talking to Beverly Wright, who started out as a young person right out of college with IBM. And she thought, well, maybe I'll stay 5 years, I'll have a child, and then I'll move on to something. And she was there 38 years.
Wow.
Yeah. So I interviewed her a couple sessions ago. Very interesting how at one point she had this insight that, oh, I'm not here for a job. I can actually take ownership of my career, and I can navigate my career within this large organization that has so much opportunity just waiting to be had.
Yeah, that was a huge shift for her. Yeah.
It was huge. Since your book came out, how has it been received?
Well, people are buying it, which is great. And I am getting feedback, especially from other coaches, that they're using it in organizations. And I've also partnered with the local SHRM chapter, Society for Human Resource Management, and done some programs with them, moderated a panel and helped with another program. So it's written really for leaders, HR, and I wasn't even thinking that much about coaches, but I'm delighted that they're able to use some of the exercises and concepts, which also include, in terms of the potential, is where am I going after talent? Is it the same place over and over again? And what could you do to diversify that so you have different results? And the idea about blind resumes, taking off names and other cultural identifiers. The former prime minister in the UK for universities told them that they needed to take off the names of the schools that people had attended, because in the UK that's a huge ranking, what school you went to. That shows your social rank, and that was then excluding a lot of people.
Wow.
So
I went to Cambridge, and now they're taking Cambridge off your resume.
Yeah.
That is so interesting. I didn't know that.
And I think, as you know, Cinder, having the support at the top, that was the prime minister. If we have the top level leadership recognizing bias is an issue, we all have it, and we don't want it to sabotage the success of our organization. So what are some things that we could do, and how do we want to manage it, and how do we want to do things differently within the organization? That really makes a huge difference. The kind of exercises that I like to do are more story-based, and I will collect ahead of time stories about when you've noticed or experienced bias against you. And then those can be either displayed on the wall and people can walk around and read them, and or you can trade, have them on paper, and then at a table they'd be shuffled around, and I might read yours out loud, and someone across the room might read mine out loud. And it's empathy, it's awareness and empathy building. This is a technique that can be used to point out when leadership is saying, no, that we don't have a problem with that doesn't exist in our organization. And the people under them are saying, yes, it does. It's one way to bring it into awareness, to bring it out in the open. And then
I like that example.
Yeah, and then once it's identified, and you know where it's showing up, then you can start to make some changes.
So in that way, you're treating everyone fairly, because you're saying, okay, we all have bias.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I co-present sometimes with an African-American colleague. And she said at the front of the room, and Marilyn's called me out on my bias before. And I said, I have. I forgot that or didn't remember that. And she said, yes, you have.
So what interesting stories you've been collecting since you published this book. I see a second book coming out with just the stories, the questions people ask you. How do I deal with this? Mm-hmm. What has been the biggest challenge for you during this process of writing the book and publishing it?
Just writing it. Cinder, you've done this before, right? It's like birthing a baby. You know, you've got to get it out. It can be challenging to get it out. Like you said, I was really committed. It was like a spiritual calling. Now is the time, and you've got to write this book. And I could see what was being done wasn't enough. And yet to actually sit down, devote the time, go through it, and then rewrite it takes a lot.
It really does. And now that it's been out, have you been traveling and presenting on the book?
I did present at the Asia Pacific Alliance of Coaches, but not on bias. I was actually told that they knew bias existed in that region of the world, but it's that saving face thing. It was kind of shameful to acknowledge and talk about it. That was just last summer, but in the meantime, since then, I have spoken with several ICF chapters in that region, done presentations on the topic. So it's opening up. People are starting to everywhere take a look at it. And that's the fun thing, is that we can meet virtually like you and I are right now. So I have been able to present internationally without leaving my office.
That is very nice.
Yeah.
So what's one thing you know now that you wish you knew before you started this venture?
It's a great question. I have to think about that for a minute. Well, if I said how hard it was, then I wouldn't have done it, maybe, and that would have been a regret. So I'm not going to say that. Just learning about the publishing process, that I could have done more research on that ahead of time, I think.
So will it be easier the second time around?
I have been invited to write a couple of other books, and one with this colleague I've been presenting with, specifically with a specific niche that she's involved in. So we'll see.
What is something that, some advice that you would give a leader, whether it's a president or a manager, some piece of advice you would give them?
About bias?
About unleashing the potential in their workforce.
I think it kind of goes back to one of the come from places we have as coaches, Cinder, is seeing each person as creative and resourceful. And that involves recognizing and taking off some of the blinders. I have an HR colleague. Their leadership team was all white males, and then he started this hiring initiative with Hispanic and Latina women, and with great results, great organizational results. The leadership team was really happy, but they never would have thought about placing an ad in a bilingual newspaper, or changing their recruiting or who they were targeting and seeing as having potential.
Nice. There's been a lot of discussion about that in the Bay Area, about how little diversity there is in some of the tech companies.
Yes, and I know Google's had this huge initiative, and they've made their data, their videos public for people to access. They have the accountability in place. That's another piece, and that impact model is the A for accountability. that they can actually have given permission to say to each other, hey, that sounds biased or that looks biased. Let's take a second look here. Still, I think they fell backwards this last year in terms of research, in terms of diversity.
Mm-hmm. That's the model that you have. Maybe you could leave us with that, is that it's impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the I is for identifying, and again, there's multiple ways of doing that. The M is for managing bias, not just saying, okay, we know it's there. Here's some ways we can handle it. The P is unleashing potential, seeing everyone as having potential, and then developing that for giving everyone the opportunity, not just a certain group. And the A is for awareness and accountability. The C is the communication model. And then the T is taking stock. We did the scorecard at the beginning. We've gone through these steps, 5 steps. Where are we now? And let's celebrate successes and look at where else we could make some changes for even greater success.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, the book is Breaking Free from Bias, and it's Marilyn O'Hearne. And I will put a link to your book and also your bio in the show notes. And
Great.
I really appreciate you joining us today and sharing your research and your proposed solutions on bias.
Thank you. Thanks. It was delightful to talk with you, Cinder. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, you're so welcome. I'm Cinder Niemela, and you've been listening to the Inspired Wisdom Podcast. Thank you for joining us. We hope these conversations illuminate your path to your highest potential. For show notes and links to resources mentioned during today's episode, please go to inspiredwisdom.us. You can also follow Inspired Wisdom on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Until next time, design a fulfilling and prosperous life that engages your talents and passions.